until a lone cowboy raised his hand. They offered her for half price, but no one dared bid. The morning sun hung low over the dusty town square in Independence, Missouri, casting long shadows across the wooden platform that stood in the center like a stage of misery. It was the summer of 1854, and the air already felt thick and heavy, clinging to skin like an unwanted blanket. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, greed, and cold indifference. Men in wide-brimmed hats stood with arms crossed, calculating eyes scanning the platform. Women in bonnets whispered behind gloved hands. Children darted between adults, too young to understand the weight of what was happening before them. On that platform stood several people, each waiting for their turn to have their worth decided by strangers. They wore simple clothing, threadbare and patched. Most kept their eyes fixed on the wooden boards beneath their bare feet, as if by not looking at the crowd, they could somehow disappear from this moment entirely. The auctioneer, a portly man with a red face and a voice that carried across the square like thunder, moved from person to person with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Then came Sarah's turn. She stepped forward when called, and immediately something felt different. While others had shuffled forward with shoulders hunched and spirits visibly crushed, Sarah walked with her back straight. Her head didn't bow, her eyes didn't seek the safety of the ground. Instead, she looked directly out at the crowd, her gaze moving from face to face as if she were the one judging them rather than the other way around. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with strong hands that spoke of hard work and eyes that held something the crowd found deeply unsettling. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that too. It was defiance. It was dignity. It was a quiet declaration that whatever they did to her body, they had not touched something essential inside her that remained entirely her own. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began his familiar speech, describing Sarah's physical attributes as if she were livestock. He mentioned her age, her health, her strong build suitable for field work or household tasks, but as he spoke, his voice carried less confidence than usual. He knew what was coming. He'd tried to sell Sarah twice before in other towns, and each time that ended in frustration and whispered warnings passed between buyers. "Do I hear an opening bid?" the auctioneer called out, his voice booming across the square. Silence answered him. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Men who had been eager to bid on others suddenly found their boots very interesting. A few exchanged glances, subtle shakes of the head passing between them like a secret language. The auctioneer's red face grew redder. "Come now, gentlemen," he tried again, forcing joviality into his tone. "A strong, healthy young woman, good for years of service. Shall we start the bidding?" More silence. But now the whispers began. "That's the one from the Anderson place," an older man muttered to his companion. "Sent her back after 3 months. Said she was teaching the others their letters." "I heard she tried to run twice from the Mitchell farm," another voice added. "They found her halfway to the Kansas border." "Troublemaker," someone else concluded, and the word passed through the crowd like wildfire. Troublemaker, troublemaker, troublemaker. Sarah heard every word. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her gaze never wavered. If anything, she seemed to stand even taller, as if their fear of her unbroken spirit was somehow a source of pride. And perhaps it was. In a world that sought to strip away every shred of humanity, her refusal to be diminished was the only power she possessed, and she wielded it like a shield. The auctioneer tried a different approach. He began listing her skills, embellishing where he could. She could cook, he claimed, though he had no real evidence of this. She could sew, manage a household, work the fields, from dawn until dusk. He painted a picture of the perfect worker, his voice growing more desperate with each unanswered appeal. Still, not a single hand rose. A plantation owner named Thornton, a large man with a thick beard and cold eyes, leaned toward his neighbor. "I don't care how strong she is," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A slave with that look in her eye? That's rebellion waiting to happen. I've got 200 people on my land. Last thing I need is someone planting ideas in their heads." His neighbor nodded in agreement. "The Harrisons bought her last year, you know. Had her less than 6 months before they brought her back. Said she convinced half their house servants they deserved wages for their work. Caused a whole uprising of sorts. Took them weeks to restore order. These stories, whether entirely true or embellished by fearful imaginations, had preceded Sarah to this auction. In the economy of slavery, she had become worthless not because she couldn't work, but because she wouldn't be broken. And an unbroken spirit was more dangerous to the system than any physical rebellion could ever be. The auctioneer removed his hat and wiped sweat from his brow, though the morning wasn't yet hot enough to warrant such perspiration. His frustration was evident in every gesture, every increasingly sharp word. This was more than just a failed sale. It was a public display of his inability to move merchandise, which hurt his reputation and his future business. Surely someone sees the value here. He tried once more, his voice cracking slightly, a young, strong woman in her prime working years. But the crowd had made its decision. They would not bid. They would not risk bringing this particular woman onto their properties. The stories had done their work too well. Sarah had become in their minds a symbol of everything they feared most, a reminder that no matter how much they tried to reduce people to property, something essential and human remained that could never truly be owned. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Other auctions continued around them, but the auctioneer stubbornly returned to Sarah again and again, determined not to admit defeat. Each attempt met the same wall of silence. The crowd began to grow restless. Some started to drift away, their interest in the day's other business outweighing their curiosity about this standoff. Sarah remained on the platform, standing in the hot sun. If she felt fear or desperation, she didn't show it. Her face remained calm, almost serene. Occasionally, the smallest hint of a smile would touch her lips, as if she found some dark humor in watching these powerful men rendered powerless by their own fear of her. A woman in the crowd, younger than most, watched Sarah with something that might have been admiration hidden behind a carefully neutral expression. She tugged on her husband's sleeve and whispered something urgent in his ear. He shook his head firmly, his response clear, even without words. No, too risky. Not worth the trouble. The woman's face fell, but she nodded her acceptance of his decision. Finally, as the afternoon sun began its descent and the crowd had thinned considerably, the auctioneer made a decision that caused a ripple of shock through those who remained. He had never done this before in all his years of conducting such business, but pride and practicality warred within him, and practicality won. "A half price," he announced, his voice tight with humiliation. "I'm reducing the price by half for immediate purchase." The remaining crowd perked up at this. Half price represented real savings, enough to make even a risky investment seem more palatable. Surely now, at such a reduced cost, someone would bid. The auctioneer waited, hope flickering in his eyes despite his better judgment. But once again, silence greeted his offer. The message was clear. Sarah wasn't worth any price if she came with the risk of disrupting the careful, violent order that these men had built their lives upon. Money mattered, certainly, but control mattered more, and Sarah represented a loss of control they simply would not accept. At the edge of the square, almost hidden by the shadow of a general store, stood a man who had been watching the entire spectacle with growing interest. He was tall and lean, with skin weathered by years under the Texas sun. Dust covered his boots and the bottom of his worn trousers. A cowboy's hat sat low on his head, and his eyes, the color of summer sky, had been fixed on Sarah for the better part of an hour. But he hadn't been watching her the way the others had, calculating her worth or potential for labor. He'd been watching something else entirely, something in the way she held herself that struck a familiar chord deep in his chest. The stranger's name was Jack Morrison, and he had traveled nearly 400 miles from his ranch in the Texas Hill Country. His purpose in independence had nothing to do with the auction happening in the square. He'd come to buy horses, specifically a breeding pair of strong quarter horses he'd heard about from a rancher 2 towns over. The auction had simply been something he'd stumbled upon while waiting for his appointment at the livestock yards on the edge of town. Jack had planned to walk right past the gathering in the square. He'd seen such auctions before, and they turned his stomach every time. But something had made him pause at the edge of the crowd, and that something was the young woman standing on the platform with her head held high like she was royalty instead of someone being sold like cattle. He'd spent the last 20 years of his life working with horses, wild mustangs mostly, caught from the open ranges and trained for riding and ranch work. In all those years, he'd developed an eye for a certain quality that separated one horse from another. It wasn't about size or strength alone, though those mattered. It was about spirit. Some horses, no matter how you worked with them, would break. They'd accept the saddle, accept the bridle, accept their fate with dull eyes and mechanical obedience. But others, the special ones, would never truly break. You could train them, earn their trust, build a partnership with them, but something wild and free would always remain in their eyes. Those were the horses worth having, the ones that would run through fire, for you not because they had to, but because they chose to. Looking at Sarah now, Jack saw that same quality, that same unbreakable something that marked the difference between existing and truly living. The auctioneer's voice cut through Jack's thoughts as the man announced the price reduction. Half price. The words carried a tone of desperation that Jack had never heard at such an event before. He watched the crowd's reaction, saw the way they shifted and murmured, but still refused to raise their hands. Their fear was obvious, almost comical in its intensity. Here were grown men, wealthy landowners who commanded hundreds of workers and thousands of acres, and they were afraid of one young woman whose only crime seemed to be refusing to pretend she was less than human. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd lived in Texas long enough to know the system, to understand how it worked and what it demanded of people. He'd never participated in it himself, had built his ranch with his own 2 hands and the help of a few paid workers who came and went as they pleased. His late wife, Martha, had been adamant about that. She'd grown up in Pennsylvania, in a household that believed slavery was a stain on the nation's soul, and she'd made Jack promise before they married that their home would never be built on such a foundation. Martha had been gone 3 years now, taken by childbirth along with the baby boy who'd never drawn a single breath. Jack still wore his wedding ring, still talked to her sometimes in the quiet of his empty ranch house. He wondered what she would say if she could see him now, standing at the edge of this crowd, watching the spectacle. He knew exactly what she'd say. He could almost hear her voice, soft but firm. "Jack Morrison, if you walk away from this and do nothing, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life." But doing something wasn't simple. Jack had come to town with money for horses, not for people. Even at half price, purchasing Sarah would take most of his available funds. He'd have to delay buying the breeding pair he'd come for, maybe have to make do with less expensive horses that wouldn't improve his stock the way he'd planned. And then there was the bigger question. What would he do with her once he'd bought her? He didn't believe in owning people, but the law said that's exactly what a purchase would make her. His property. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. The auctioneer was speaking again, his voice carrying a sharp edge of frustration. "This is a final offer, gentlemen. Half the original price for immediate purchase. If there are no bids, I'll be moving on to the next item on today's schedule." The crowd remained silent. A few men had already turned away, heading toward other parts of the square where different auctions were taking place. One man spat tobacco juice into the dirt and muttered something about too much trouble for any price to his companion. They both laughed, a harsh sound that made Jack's hands curl into fists at his sides. Sarah stood perfectly still on the platform. The sun beat down on her head and shoulders, and Jack could see small beads of sweat on her forehead, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't fidget or show any sign of discomfort. Instead, she continued her steady survey of the crowd, her eyes moving from face to face with that same unsettling directness. When her gaze swept past Jack's position at the edge of the square, he felt the force of it even from a distance. There was intelligence in those eyes, and anger, and a deep well of something that looked like determination. She wasn't hoping to be saved, Jack realized. She wasn't looking at the crowd with pleading or desperation, silently begging someone to buy her and take her away from this moment. Instead, she seemed to be memorizing faces, cataloging each person who stood by and watched, filing away this moment for some future reckoning that only she could imagine. The auctioneer raised his hand, preparing to wave Sarah off the platform and declare her unsold. In the world of such auctions, this was the ultimate humiliation, to be deemed not worth purchasing at any price. Jack knew what would happen next. She'd be taken back to wherever she'd been held, and the auctioneer would try again next week in another town, or the month after that in yet another location. Eventually, someone would take a chance on her, probably someone who specialized in breaking difficult cases, someone who would see her spirit as a challenge to be crushed rather than a quality to be respected. That thought made Jack's decision for him. His hand started to rise before his brain had fully processed what he was doing. It felt like someone else was moving his arm, lifting it slowly into the air, while his thoughts raced to catch up with his actions. This was crazy. This was impulsive. This was going to change everything about his carefully ordered life. Martha's voice whispered in his mind again. "Good. It's about time something did." The crowd noticed his raised hand before the auctioneer did. A ripple of surprise moved through the remaining people, heads turning to stare at this stranger who had appeared from nowhere, to do what none of them would do. Whispers started immediately, questions about who he was and where he'd come from and what kind of fool would take on such obvious trouble. The auctioneer spotted Jack's raised hand, and his entire demeanor changed in an instant. Relief flooded his red face, followed quickly by suspicion. He'd been burned before by false bids, by people raising their hands as jokes or changing their minds at the last second. He squinted at Jack, trying to read his intentions. "Sir?" the auctioneer called out, his voice careful now, controlled. "Are you placing a bid?" Jack's throat felt dry. His hand remained in the air, steady despite the trembling he felt inside. "I am," he said, and his voice carried across the square more clearly than he'd expected. "At the reduced price of half the original amount?" "Yes." The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. "And you have the funds available for immediate payment?" Jack patted the leather pouch at his belt, the one that held his horse-buying money. "I do." For a moment, the auctioneer seemed torn between relief at finally making a sale and concern about this unusual buyer. But business was business, and a sale was a sale. He couldn't afford to be too particular, not after the public embarrassment of the last hour. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, bringing his hand down sharply. "To the gentleman in the back. Please come forward to complete the transaction." Jack's legs felt strange as he walked through the parting crowd toward the platform. Every eye followed him, and he could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their barely concealed amusement at what they clearly thought was a terrible mistake. Let them think what they wanted. He'd stopped caring about the opinions of strangers a long time ago. On the platform, Sarah watched him approach. If she felt relief or fear or anything else, her face didn't show it. She simply watched, waiting to see what kind of man had just purchased her, trying to read in his weathered face and dusty clothes what her future might hold. Jack reached the platform and looked up at her. Their eyes met properly for the first time, and something passed between them in that moment, not understanding exactly, but a kind of recognition. She saw something in him that surprised her. He saw something in her that confirmed everything he'd observed from a distance. The auctioneer was shuffling papers, preparing the bill of sale. Jack forced himself to look away from Sarah and focus on the transaction at hand. He counted out the money carefully, watching as the auctioneer's greedy fingers swept the coins into a small box. In exchange, Jack received a piece of paper with words written on it that made his skin crawl. Words that declared Sarah to be property, that listed her like one might list a horse or a piece of furniture, that reduced a human being to an item of commerce. The auctioneer handed Jack the papers with a satisfied smile, clearly relieved to have this difficult transaction finally completed. "She's all yours now," he said, as if discussing the sale of a plow or a wagon. "I'd recommend keeping a close watch on this one. She's got a reputation for causing disruption." Jack took the papers and folded them carefully, sliding them into his vest pocket without looking at them. He didn't want to read those words again, didn't want to see Sarah's life reduced to measurements and estimated value. Instead, he turned his attention back to the platform where she still stood, watching him with those sharp, calculating eyes. "Come down from there," Jack said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. It wasn't a command exactly, more like an invitation. He held out his hand to help her down the platform steps, an automatic gesture of courtesy that seemed to surprise both Sarah and the few remaining onlookers. Sarah stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. In her experience, men who purchased people at auction didn't offer helping hands or common courtesies. They gave orders and expected immediate obedience. This man was different somehow, and different could mean better, or it could mean more dangerous. She had no way of knowing which yet. Finally, she placed her hand in his and stepped down from the platform. Her hand was rough with calluses, the hand of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. Jack's hand was equally worn, marked by years of ranch work and rope burns and all the small injuries that came with training horses and mending fences and building a life from raw land. As soon as her feet touched the ground, Sarah pulled her hand back and crossed her arms, her defensive posture returning immediately. She stood beside Jack, but not close to him, maintaining a careful distance that spoke of years of learned caution. The crowd was beginning to disperse now that the entertainment of the standoff had ended. A few men cast curious glances back at Jack and Sarah as they walked away, already forming stories in their minds about the foolish stranger who'd bought trouble for himself. One older man shook his head sadly, as if he'd just witnessed someone make a terrible business decision that would surely lead to ruin. Jack ignored them all. He turned to Sarah and spoke in that same quiet tone. "I've got a horse tied up at the general store. We need to collect my supplies and then we'll be heading out. It's a long ride to Texas."
Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the word Texas.
That was far away, farther than she'd ever traveled. Every other time she'd been sold, it had been to someone relatively nearby, someone who operated in the same familiar territory of Missouri and its neighboring states. Texas meant something different, something unknown. Wow. She didn't know if that was good or bad. "Can you ride?" Jack asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, not judgment. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I can sit a horse," she said. These were the first words she'd spoken since Jack had been on her, and her voice was stronger than he'd expected. Clear and steady despite everything she'd just endured. "I'm not fancy at it, but I won't fall off." "That's all I need to know for now," Jack said. "The rest you can learn as we go." He started walking toward the general store, and Sarah fell into step beside him, though she maintained the careful distance. As they walked through the town square, Sarah noticed the way people stared. Some looked shocked, others disapproving, and a few seemed almost amused. She'd grown used to being stared at, but usually it was with the cold appraisal of potential buyers. This was different. These people were judging not just her, but the man who'd bought her, and they clearly found his decision questionable at best. At the general store, Jack's horse stood tied to the hitching post, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a patient demeanor. Supplies were already loaded in saddlebags, provisions for the long journey back to Texas. Jack checked the straps and buckles with practiced efficiency, his hands moving with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of repetition. "Wait here," he said to Sarah, then disappeared into the store. Sarah stood beside the horse, unsure of what to do with herself. The animal turned its head to look at her, snuffling softly. Without thinking, she reached out and stroked its nose, and the horse leaned into her touch. There was something calming about the simple contact, the warmth of the animal's breath against her palm. Jack emerged from the store a few minutes later carrying a bundle. He handed it to Sarah, and she unfolded it to find a simple but sturdy set of riding clothes, pants instead of a skirt, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun. "You can't ride all the way to Texas in what you're wearing," Jack explained. "There's a place behind the store where you can change. Be quick about it. I want to get a few miles behind us before we stop for the night." Sarah clutched the clothes, stunned by this small act of consideration. She'd expected many things from this transaction, but practical kindness hadn't been one of them. She hurried behind the store and changed quickly, leaving her old dress folded neatly on a barrel. The pants felt strange at first, unfamiliar, but she could immediately see the practicality of them for riding. The hat was too big, but she adjusted it as best she could. When she came back around to the front, Jack was leading a second horse from the livery stable across the street, a smaller mare with gentle eyes. "This is Rosie," he said. "I was going to use her as a pack horse, but you'll ride her instead. We'll redistribute the supplies between both horses." Sarah approached the mare slowly, letting the animal get used to her scent. Rosie sniffed at her curiously, then seemed to accept her presence. Sarah ran her hand along the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of muscles beneath the smooth coat. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly, and there was genuine appreciation in her voice. Jack grunted in acknowledgement as he adjusted the saddle on Rosie's back. "She's got a good temperament. Won't give you trouble as long as you treat her right." He paused, then added, "Same as most creatures, I suppose." Within minutes they were both mounted and ready to ride. Jack sat tall in his saddle with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. Sarah settled onto Rosie's back more cautiously, her body remembering the basics of riding from years ago when she'd been allowed to ride to market with a previous owner. As they prepared to leave Independence behind, Jack turned to Sarah one more time. "It's 4 days to my ranch, maybe 5, depending on weather and how fast we can travel. We'll camp at night, stay away from towns as much as possible. I don't want trouble, and I expect you don't either." Sarah met his eyes, trying once again to read this strange man who'd bought her. "What happens when we get to your ranch?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. Jack was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to answer. When he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "When we get to my ranch, you'll work. I've got land that needs tending, horses that need training, and more chores than one person can handle alone. It's hard work, sun up to sundown most days. But," he paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal, "but I need you to understand something right now, before we go any further." Sarah waited, her hands tight on the reins. "I don't believe in what happened back there in that square," Jack continued, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. "I don't believe one person should own another. My wife, she felt even stronger about it than I do. But the law says I own you now, and that's a fact we both have to live with, at least for the time being." He shifted in his saddle, his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead rather than on Sarah. "Here's what I'm proposing. You work my ranch for 7 years. You learn everything I can teach you about horses, about land management, about ranching. At the end of those 7 years, I'll give you freedom papers, legal documents that say you're a free woman. And I'll give you a horse of your own and enough money to make a start somewhere, wherever you want to go." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. 7 years seemed like an eternity, but it was also something finite, a specific endpoint to work toward. And the promise of true freedom at the end of it, not just empty words, but actual papers that would protect her under the law, that was more than she'd ever dared hope for. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying all her confusion and suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Jack finally turned to look at her, and his blue eyes were serious and sad all at once. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I saw you standing up there on that platform, refusing to let them break you, and I recognize something in you that deserves better than what this world has been giving you." He gathered his reins, preparing to ride. "But I need to know right now if you can accept those terms. 7 years of honest work in exchange for freedom and a fair start at the end of it. And I need to know if you'll give me your word that you won't run during those 7 years. I can't chase you down if you decide to leave, and I won't try. But if you run, you'll be running without papers, without protection, and the world is hard on people in that situation. You'd likely end up right back on an auction block, maybe in worse circumstances than before." Sarah sat very still on Rosie's back, her mind racing through the implications of what Jack was offering. It could be a lie, a trick to keep her compliant during the journey. Or it could be genuine, a real chance at something she thought was impossible. She studied Jack's face, looking for signs of deception, but all she saw was a tired, lonely man who seemed to be carrying his own weight of grief and regret. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. 7 years. Freedom? A horse of her own. The words echoed in her mind, each one carrying possibilities she'd barely allowed herself to imagine during the long, dark years of her life. She'd learned early not to trust promises from people who held power over her. Promises were easy to make and even easier to break, especially when the law protected those who broke them and punished those who believed in them. But something in Jack's weathered face, in the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes when he spoke about his wife, in the roughness of his voice when he said the words, "right thing to do," made her pause. This man wasn't comfortable with what he'd just done. Buying her had clearly gone against something in his nature, had violated some internal principle he held. Yet he'd done it anyway, and now he was offering her something that sounded too good to be true. Sarah had survived this long by trusting her instincts, by reading people the way Jack read horses. And her instincts, despite all her learned caution and suspicion, were telling her that this man meant what he said. "I give you my word," she said finally, her voice clear and firm. 7 years of honest work, I won't run." Jack nodded once, sharp and decisive, as if they'd just sealed a business agreement between equals. "Then let's ride. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dark." They left Independence behind, the horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust on the dry road leading south. Sarah looked back once at the town, at the square where she'd stood just an hour ago, believing her life might get infinitely worse. Now she was riding toward an unknown future with a strange man who'd made her impossible promises. Whether those promises would hold remained to be seen, but at least she was moving forward rather than standing still in despair. The first day of riding passed mostly in silence. Jack set a steady pace, not too fast but not slow either, the pace of someone who had a long journey ahead and knew how to measure his energy and his horse's stamina. Sarah focused on staying in the saddle, on remembering the rhythm of riding, on adjusting to Rosie's gait. The mare was patient with her, seeming to sense when Sarah's balance faltered and adjusting her stride accordingly. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Jack called for breaks every few hours, leading them to shaded spots where the horses could rest and drink from his water supply. During these stops, he'd check Rosie's hooves and tack, teaching Sarah the proper way to inspect a horse for signs of strain or injury. "A horse will work itself to death for you if you let it," Jack explained during one such stop, running his hands down Rosie's legs to check for swelling or heat. "It's your job to know when to stop, when to rest, when to push forward. You learn to read the animal, to understand what it's telling you through 100 small signs." Sarah watched carefully, absorbing the information. She'd been around horses before, but never like this. Never with someone actually teaching her the why behind the what. Previous owners had given her tasks to complete, but never explanations, never the kind of knowledge that might make her more capable and therefore more valuable to herself. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Jack glanced at her, then returned his attention to the horse. "Because you'll need to know it. On my ranch we work with horses every day, training them, selling them, breeding them. If you're going to pull your weight, you need to understand them." He straightened up, patting Rosie's shoulder. "Besides, knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you once you have it. Seems like the least I can give you for the next 7 years." They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing around them. The settled farmlands of Missouri gave way to wilder country, to rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed in the wind like waves on a golden ocean. Sarah had never seen such open space before. All her life had been spent in confined areas, in towns and farms where every piece of land was claimed and controlled and put to specific use. This openness was both exhilarating. As evening approached, Jack began looking for a suitable campsite. He found a spot near a small creek, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees that provided both shade and concealment. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, swinging down from his horse. "There's water for the horses and enough cover to hide our fire." Sarah dismounted more stiffly, her legs protesting after so many hours in the saddle. She'd ridden before, but never for such sustained periods, and her body was reminding her of muscles she'd forgotten she had. If Jack noticed her discomfort, he didn't comment on it. Instead, he set about making camp with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown in everything else. He unsaddled the horses, showing Sarah how to properly remove the tack and check the animals for saddle sores. He hobbled them near the creek where they could graze and drink freely. Then he began gathering wood for a fire while Sarah watched, uncertain of her role in all this. "Don't just stand there," Jack said, not unkindly. "Start unpacking the food supplies from those saddlebags. We'll need the coffee pot, the pan, and whatever dried meat and beans you can find." Sarah moved to follow his instructions, grateful to have a task. As she unpacked the supplies, she found herself working alongside Jack in a rhythm that felt strange, but not unpleasant. He built the fire while she prepared the food. He filled the coffee pot from the creek while she arranged their simple meal. There was no discussion of roles or expectations. They simply worked together like two people who both understood that survival required cooperation. As the fire crackled to life and the smell of coffee began to fill the air, Jack finally sat down with a heavy sigh. The lines on his face seemed deeper in the firelight, and Sarah realized he was probably older than she'd first thought, maybe in his early 40s. The hard life of ranching had aged him, carved years into his features that perhaps weren't truly there yet. "Tell me about yourself," Jack said suddenly, startling Sarah from her thoughts. "Where are you from originally?" Sarah stiffened, her instinct always to reveal as little as possible about herself. But then she remembered his words about trust, about the agreement they'd made. If they were going to spend 7 years together, some level of honesty would be necessary. "Virginia," she said quietly, stirring the beans in the pan. "I was born on a tobacco plantation there. My mother was a cook in the main house. My father worked the fields. I don't remember much about them. I was sold away when I was 8 years old." Jack was quiet for a moment, and when Sarah glanced at him, she saw pain in his eyes. "That's too young," he said roughly. "No child should be separated from their family at that age." "No child should be sold at all," Sarah replied, and there was steel in her voice. "But that's the world we live in." "For now," Jack said, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. "Things are changing. Slowly, maybe too slowly, but they're changing. There are whole territories now where slavery isn't allowed, states joining the Union as free states. It won't last forever, this system." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she'd heard similar optimistic predictions before, usually from people who weren't directly affected by the system they claimed was dying. "Maybe," she said noncommittally, "but change won't come in time to give me back the years I've already lost." "No," Jack agreed. "It won't. Nothing can give you that. But maybe we can make the next 7 years different. Maybe we can give you skills and knowledge and resources that will make whatever comes after those 7 years better." They ate their simple meal in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them and the horses making soft sounds from where they grazed nearby. The stars began to emerge overhead, more stars than Sarah had ever seen, unobscured by town lights or tree cover. After they'd finished eating and cleaned their few dishes in the creek, Jack spread out bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. He handed Sarah a blanket, thick wool that smelled of horse and smoke in the outdoors. "Get some sleep," he advised. "Tomorrow will be another long day of riding, and they don't get easier before they get harder." But Sarah found sleep difficult to find. She lay wrapped in the blanket, staring up at the vast expanse of stars, her mind churning with thoughts and questions and cautious hope. Across the fire, she could hear Jack's breathing eventually settle into the steady rhythm of sleep, and she marveled at his apparent comfort with this situation. He'd bought a stranger today, someone with a reputation for trouble, and now he slept peacefully with that same person just a few feet away. Either he was remarkably trusting, or he believed so deeply in the agreement they'd made that he saw no threat in her presence. Sarah wasn't sure which possibility unsettled her more. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. The sun broke camp efficiently and rode through changing landscapes. Jack continued to teach her about horses, about reading the land, about the practical skills she'd need on the ranch. He pointed out edible plants, showed her how to track game, explained how to predict weather by watching the behavior of animals and the formation of clouds. Sarah absorbed it all like parched earth soaking up rain. Every piece of knowledge felt like a gift, like a tool she could use to build some kind of future. And slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, the tight knot of suspicion in her chest began to loosen. Jack wasn't like anyone she'd encountered before. He didn't treat her with the casual cruelty she'd learned to expect, but neither did he treat her with pity or false kindness. He spoke to her like a person, asked her opinions, listened when she answered, when she made a mistake, like the time she unsaddled Rosie incorrectly and the blanket slipped. He corrected her without anger or mockery, simply showing her the right way and explaining why it mattered. On the fourth evening, as they made camp in the shadow of low hills that Jack said marked the beginning of Texas territory, Sarah finally asked a question that had been building in her mind. "Your wife," she said carefully, watching Jack's face for signs that she'd overstepped. "You mentioned she felt strongly about all this. What was she like?" Jack's hands stilled on the rope he'd been coiling. For a long moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd pushed too far into territory he wasn't willing to share. But then he spoke, his voice soft with memory. She was steel-wrapped in kindness, he said. Jack's eyes grew distant as he spoke about Martha, looking past the fire and the darkening Texas landscape to some memory only he could see. She came from Pennsylvania, from a family that believed every person deserved dignity and freedom, no matter the color of their skin. When I met her, I was just a young ranch hand working for wages, trying to save enough to buy my own piece of land. She was visiting relatives in San Antonio, and I saw her at a church social. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. She was the most stubborn woman I'd ever met, had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them, even when those opinions weren't popular, especially when they weren't popular. He paused, poking at the fire with a stick. She made me promise, before we married, that we'd never participate in the system. Said she couldn't build a life with a man who believed some people were property. Sarah listened quietly, understanding now why Jack had made the choices he'd made in independence. He wasn't just following his own conscience. He was honoring a promise to someone he'd loved. "She died 3 years ago," Jack continued, his voice rougher now. "Childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. A boy. We'd already picked out a name." He cleared his throat. "After that, I threw myself into the ranch work. Easier to exhaust yourself with physical labor than to sit with grief. But sometimes when I'm faced with a decision, I still hear her voice asking me what I'm going to do, what kind of man I'm choosing to be." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Sarah said softly. "She was," Jack agreed. "And she would have liked you, I think. Would have approved of your refusal to be broken down, to pretend you were less than you are." He looked at Sarah directly then. "That's why I bid on you, if I'm being honest. I saw that same quality in you that Martha had, that core of steel that won't bend no matter how much pressure gets applied." The next morning, they crossed fully into Texas territory. The land here was different from anywhere Sarah had been before, wider and wilder, with fewer signs of human settlement. Jack explained that they still had nearly 2 full days of riding before they'd reach his ranch, which sat in the hill country west of San Antonio. As they rode, Jack began describing the ranch in more detail. "It's not a large operation by Texas standards," he said. "About 500 acres, mostly grazing land, with some wooded areas near the creek that runs through the property. I've got a small herd of cattle, maybe 50 head, but the real business is horses. I catch wild mustangs, train them, and sell them to ranchers and the occasional military buyer." "You catch them yourself?" Sarah asked, trying to imagine the process. "Mostly. Sometimes I hire help for the big roundups, but the training I do alone. Or I did alone," he corrected himself. "That'll be part of your work, helping with the training. It's dangerous sometimes. Horses are powerful animals, and wild ones can be unpredictable. But it's also the most rewarding work I've ever done, taking something wild and scared and helping it learn to trust, to partner with humans instead of fighting them." Sarah heard the passion in his voice and understood something important. Jack didn't just work with horses as a means to earn money. He genuinely loved them, understood them, saw them as individuals rather than simply livestock. It reminded her of the way he'd approached their own arrangement, offering partnership instead of demanding subservience. That afternoon, they encountered their first test of the agreement between them. They'd stopped at a small town to buy additional supplies, and while Jack was in the general store, a man approached Sarah where she waited with the horses. He was heavy-set with mean eyes and breath that smelled of whiskey, even though it was barely past noon. "You belong to that man in the store?" he asked, his words slightly slurred. Sarah's entire body tensed, every instinct screaming danger, but she kept her voice level. "I'm traveling with him, yes. Doesn't keep proper control of his property, does he? Leaving you out here alone where you could run off." The man stepped closer, and Sarah could smell the sourness of his unwashed body. Maybe you need an owner who knows how to keep a tighter rein on things. Sarah's hand moved subtly to the knife Jack had given her for cutting rope and preparing food. She didn't draw it, but she made sure her fingers were positioned to grab it quickly if needed. You should step back, she said firmly. The man laughed, an unpleasant sound. Or what? You're going to have a problem with me. Jack's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. He'd emerged from the store without either of them noticing, and now he stood with supplies in one arm and his other hand resting on the gun at his hip. His entire demeanor had changed from the patient teacher of the past days to something harder, more dangerous. The drunk man's eyes went from Sarah to Jack and back again, calculating his odds. Apparently deciding discretion was the better option, he held up his hands and backed away. No offense meant, friend. Just making conversation. Find someone else to converse with, Jack said coldly. He waited until the man had stumbled away before turning to Sarah. You all right? Sarah nodded, releasing the breath she'd been holding. I am. Thank you. You handled that well, Jack observed as he secured the supplies to his saddle. Kept calm, didn't escalate, but didn't back down either. That's good instinct. He swung into his saddle. But from now on, when we stop in towns, you stay close to me. There are men who see opportunities in situations like this, and I'd rather not have to shoot someone over their stupidity. They left the town quickly, both of them more alert now to the potential dangers of their journey. Sarah realized that while Jack's protection was valuable, it also highlighted how precarious her position truly was. The papers in Jack's pocket might say she was his property, but those same papers offered her no real protection from others who might decide to challenge his ownership or simply take what they wanted when he wasn't looking. On their final evening before reaching the ranch, as they camped under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, Jack returned to the topic of what would happen when they arrived. The ranch house is simple, he said. 2 rooms, basically. A main room with a kitchen area and fireplace, and a bedroom. You'll take the bedroom. I've been sleeping on a cot in the main room since Martha died anyway. Can't seem to bring myself to use that bed anymore. Sarah started to protest, but Jack held up his hand. It's not negotiable. You need privacy, a space that's yours. The work will be hard enough without you feeling like you have no place to retreat to. He poured them both coffee from the pot, the bitter smell mixing with wood smoke. Tomorrow you'll meet the ranch properly. See the land, the horses, the work that needs doing. It'll be overwhelming at first. There's always more to do than hours in the day to do it. But we'll start slow, build up your skills gradually. I'm not afraid of hard work, Sarah said. I know, Jack replied. I saw that in you back in Independence. But there's a difference between being willing to work hard and knowing how to do the specific work a ranch requires. You'll learn I'm a decent teacher when I want to be, and you strike me as a quick student. The next day, as the sun climbed toward its peak, they crested a hill, and Jack pulled his horse to a stop. There, he said, pointing to the valley below. That's home. Sarah looked where he indicated and saw a modest wooden house nestled in a valley with a creek running beside it. There were several outbuildings, corrals, and stretching beyond them, rolling grassland dotted with horses. Even from this distance, she could see the animals moving, their coats catching the sunlight. Something shifted in Sarah's chest as she looked at the scene below. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet. Hope was still too dangerous, too likely to lead to disappointment, but it was something adjacent to hope, something that whispered maybe, just maybe, this could be different. It rode down into the valley, and as they got closer, Sarah could see the details Jack had mentioned. The house was indeed simple but well-maintained, with a covered porch and windows that looked out over the land. The outbuildings included a barn, a stable, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything showed signs of careful upkeep, the kind that came from someone who took pride in their property. As they approached the main corral, several horses lifted their heads to watch their arrival. They were beautiful animals, muscled and alert, with the wild look in their eyes that suggested they hadn't been domesticated for long. One in particular, a black stallion with a white star on his forehead, pawed at the ground and snorted, his entire body radiating barely contained energy. That's Shadow, Jack said, noticing Sarah's attention. Caught him 4 months ago. Still working on earning his trust. He's going to be magnificent once he's fully trained, but right now he's all fire and fight. They dismounted and Jack began showing Sarah around the property. He pointed out where the feed was stored, where the water came from, where the tools were kept. He walked her through the process of settling the horses after a long journey, demonstrating the proper care and attention each animal deserved. As the sun began to set on Sarah's first day at the ranch, Jack lit a fire on the hearth and prepared a simple meal. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the clean scent of the soap Jack used to wash the trail dust from his hands. "Tomorrow we start the real work," Jack said as they ate. "I'll teach you everything I know about horses, about this land, about making a life out here. It won't be easy, and there'll be days you'll want to curse my name for bringing you here. But at the end of 7 years, you'll walk away from this place with skills that will serve you anywhere you choose to go." Sarah looked around the simple house, at the man who'd bought her freedom, even if he'd had to purchase her to do it, at the land stretching beyond the windows that represented both work and possibility. 7 years seemed both impossibly long and surprisingly short. "I'll hold you to that," she said, and so began a partnership that would transform both of them. Over the following years, Sarah learned everything Jack had promised to teach her, and more. She discovered she had a natural gift for working with horses, an intuitive understanding of their moods and needs that even Jack acknowledged was rare. The wild mustangs responded to her touch, to her patient persistence, to her refusal to break them while still teaching them to trust. The work was indeed hard, harder than anything Sarah had done before. There were days when her muscles screamed in protest, when her hands bled from rope burns, when she collapsed into bed too exhausted even to eat. But there were also moments of profound satisfaction, like the first time a horse she'd been training accepted a saddle without fighting, or when she successfully delivered a foal during a difficult birth, or when Jack nodded his approval at a job well done.